means the end of healthcare in America. The last speech actually included this phrase, a vote for Amy Barrett is a vote to end healthcare. The speech said, a vote for Amy Coney Barrett is a vote to end healthcare. That isn't just preposterous, it is so destructive of the public good and of public trust. And I don't want this body to continue its decline, but I hope that next April, May, or June, when the Supreme Court rules and when Obamacare doesn't die, as no expert thinks this case is actually going to do, there's nobody no court watchers who really believe that the Supreme Court is going to end Obamacare this year. Severability is a pretty important legal concept that those of us who serve as public servants for a time should be helping the American people understand. And yet nobody on the other side of the aisle is talking about severability, even though everybody watching the court case knows that even if the opponents of Obamacare prevail in this case, that severability is what everyone expects will actually happen. And yet we hear again and again and again this rhetoric just motivated by the cynical desire to get people to vote out of fear and panic in the November elections. Nobody really believes this stuff. And so I hope the Democrats that are making these speeches, staying here all night to say again and again things like a vote for Amy Coney Barrett is a vote to end health care, please have the courage to come back next April, May, and June and say you lied to the American people. You were just trying to scare them into voting, and say what you were saying was BS. Whoever writes these outside talking points, it's really destructive, and the senators know better than to parrot this pap. So they're out of arguments, but they're not out of sound bites. And one of the things that's true in American life is that with freedom of speech, even if your sound bite is nonsense, you have the right to be wrong and you have the right to say it. So given that we're going to be here all day, it's all over but the shouting, it seems like we don't have to play the same speeches on repeat over and over again. We can actually do two things. And I think that we should spend a little bit of time reviewing how we got here and a little bit of time talking about where we go next. First, we should explicitly name the Senate's most valuable player. And as somebody who is a junior member of this body, I don't want to cross Cocaine Mitch, the gentleman from Kentucky. But the truth of the matter is, the senator most responsible for the confirmation proceedings we have happening on the floor today is not from Kentucky. The senator most responsible for the fact that Amy Coney Barrett's going to be confirmed tonight, the senator most responsible for the confirmations of Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, is the former Democratic leader from Nevada, Senator Harry Reid. It was Senator Harry Reid that blew up the filibuster for judicial appointments in November of 2013, and the rest of how we got here is just a footnote on that history. Leader McConnell walked through some of this history on Friday and Saturday, how at every turn, from Robert Bork to Brett Kavanaugh, many progressives have, in an effort to try to secure policy outcomes in the Supreme Court, been escalating the confirmation wars. I won't repeat all of that history from Friday and Saturday here, but when Harry Reid went nuclear, he set the Senate on a path to this day. So here we are, with more than 200 federal judges confirmed in the last 4 years. Again, I've been on the floor for the last 4 hours, so I've heard multiple people lament the pace of judicial confirmations on the floor. Some people love it, some people hate it, but whether you got hate mail or you got love letters, your destination address should be Las Vegas, Nevada. There is simply no equivalent or comparable event in the confirmation escalation wars since they were created with the borking of Robert Bork in 1987. There's simply no comparable event with November of 2013 when Harry Reid decided to make this body simply majoritarian on confirmations. So where do we go next? It is no secret that some of my colleagues on the left are itching to blow up the legislative filibuster. It's a slightly better kept secret that a whole bunch of Democrats in the Senate think this is a really bad idea, but they're scared to death of the activist groups that have decided to go after Dianne Feinstein in the last 3 weeks as a sort of trial run to show what happens to people who would resist trying to turn the Senate into a simple majoritarian body. But I still want to at least compliment those folks in this body who've started to talk openly about their desire to blow up the filibuster for legislative process as well around here. I think it would be a very destructive thing to do, but I appreciate the people who are at least talking about it explicitly. I've been fighting about some of this with my friend Chris Coons. He is now open to blowing up the legislative filibuster, even though he was the leader of the Senate letter in, I think it was January of 2017, in defense of the filibuster. The position he had then, when there was a new administration of a different party, is the position that I had then, and it's still the position that I have now, and regardless of what party holds power around here in 2021 or 2025, I'm still going to be defending the Senate as a supermajoritarian body that tries to actually have a deliberative process. So I think that my friend Chris is wrong about being open to blowing up the legislative filibuster, but I don't think he's wrong because he's a Democrat. I think a whole bunch of Republicans were wrong about this issue in January of 2017, and so I fought with them as well. I got lots of angry calls and texts from Republican members of the House of Representatives in early 2017 for defending the legislative filibuster because the House and Senate are supposed to be different kinds of bodies. We have different purposes. And so my argument to Democrats now or in January is the same as the argument I made to Republicans in January of 2017, and that is that blowing up the filibuster would be to functionally kill the Senate. It would dramatically change not just this institution, but the structure of governance in our republic. Because without the filibuster, the Senate becomes just another majoritarian body, and we already have one of those. It's called the House of Representatives. The House and the Senate are supposed to have different complementary functions, and if we kill the filibuster in the Senate, we will have simple 51 to 49 votes, radically changing the direction of the country. We would see governance swings on a pendulum where big chunks of American life could be rewritten every 2 years with simple 51 to 49 or 49 to 51 majority changes and therefore new majority votes. We would become more like a parliamentary European system. It's a system that has some virtues, but we don't have that system, and our founders didn't pick that system on purpose. In an age of declining trust and increasing cynicism, the answer is surely not more instability. This would deplete, not replenish, our declining reservoirs of public trust. Killing the deliberative structure of the Senate would accelerate Congress's ongoing, slow, and bipartisan suicide, where fewer and fewer decisions are made by the people's elected representatives, and more decisions would be made by an unelected bureaucracy that the people back home that we represent in Nebraska or New York or Rhode Island or Virginia, the speeches that I've been hearing this morning, where those folks don't have any power to hire or fire people that work in the administrative state, and accountability of governance to the people means that we want the elected representatives to be making most of those decisions, not the unelectable bureaucracy. Even though lots of those people are well-meaning public servants, they're simply not accountable to the public. Senators like Joe Manchin, John Tester, Kyrsten Sinema would see diminished influence as the people of West Virginia, Montana, and Arizona got increasingly sidelined for even more representation of New York and California. Some of my colleagues apparently want to finish the work that Senator Reid began, but this would be to double down on the division, the cynicism, and the partisanship. And they would pretend that that is a day that they would never regret. But I think it would be really useful for more of the folks who are thinking now about whether they're either in favor of ending the legislative filibuster or whether they're too scared to stand up to the activist groups that are demanding they end the legislative filibuster. It would be useful for a lot more of them to go on the record with the things they say to me in private about their regrets about November of 2013. I've only been here since January of 2015, and I've had either 7 or 8 different Democrats currently serving in this body tell me how much they regret the vote that they took at Harry Reid's urging in 2013 to end the filibuster for confirmations to the judiciary. And I understand that a junior Republican senator from Nebraska doesn't have a lot of sway in the Democratic conference, but maybe they would listen to the quote of a different, more influential senator. The quote is this: "If the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who ask us to be their voice, then I fear that the partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything. That does not serve anybody's best interest, and it certainly is not what the patriots who founded this democracy had in mind. We owe the people who sent us here much better than that. We owe them much, much more." Again, I'm going to repeat the quote. "If the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who ask us to be their vote, then I fear the partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything. That does not serve anybody's interests, and it certainly is not what the patriots who founded this democracy had in mind. We owe the people who sent us here more than that. We owe them much, much more." Close quote. That quote was from the junior senator from Illinois in 2005, Senator Barack Obama, speaking passionately to this body about why it was different, why it is different, and why we have a stewardship obligation to defend the deliberative structure of the Senate. Senator, then President Obama was right then, he is right now, and I fear that he will sadly be right in the future if partisan tribalists decide to blow up the Senate and pack the Supreme Court. The debate over Amy Coney Barrett is over. We will be voting soon. But in the coming months, the debate for a critical piece of American governance will start. And I beg my colleagues to heed Senator Obama's advice. Protect America's structure of three branches of government. You lost this vote, but please don't burn down this institution. Again, you lost this vote under the rules that Harry Reid created in 2013. Please don't burn down this institution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Good morning to you, and C-SPAN watchers everywhere. We're here in part because of a Supreme Court nomination, but we're here also because of a Supreme Court process that has turned foul in a considerable number of ways. And I'd like to spend the time that I have with you this morning walking through some of the history that got us there. With respect to the now standard Republican talking point that the only reason that we're here today in this partisan wrangle is because of Harry Reid, I would submit that the spectacle of procedural wreckage that surrounds all three of the last Supreme Court nominees completely belies any suggestion that Senator McConnell would have respected the filibuster of a Supreme Court judge. They've broken essentially every rule that got in their way. It didn't matter what it was, over and over again. And the idea that they would break every rule but that one simply makes no sense. So I can see that it's sort of a cute and clever argument to go back and point out that Harry Reid broke the effort to stonewall all of President Obama's appointees to the D.C. Circuit Court, which was what was going on at the time. But the rest of the wreckage belies that this would have been protected by Leader McConnell in the mad, headlong rush to load up the Supreme Court with nominees who have been through this very, very peculiar Supreme Court process. And to those who wonder why it is that we talk a lot about health care in the context of this nominee, look no further than the Republican Party platform that my colleagues supported, which says that Republican presidents will appoint judges to reverse the Obamacare cases. That is the language from their own party platform. So expect some skepticism about the sincerity of Republican expressions that they are shocked that we would try to tie the fate of the Affordable Care Act to this nominee when they have put that in their party platform. One of the unpleasant aspects of the process that I'm about to describe has been that the handoff to special interests of control over who gets appointed to the Supreme Court means that there's an audience for auditioning. And over again, we have seen judges audition to that audience in order to get onto that all-important Federalist Society list, or in the case of Judge Kavanaugh, excuse me, to get escorted by Leonard Leo, the operative of that operation, right around the list and onto its very top. Nobody auditioned like Brett Kavanaugh. But Judge Barrett made her own effort, and that was to make it very publicly clear that she disagreed with Justice Roberts, the swing vote who protected Obamacare. And that mattered because the outrage in the right wing that their Supreme Court, that they thought they had claimed, actually made one decision against their political interests, the sense of betrayal by Justice Roberts, that was very acute. And it was into that environment that Judge Barrett added her unsolicited opinion, just threw it out there, that Roberts was wrong, that the dissent had it right, and obviously that allows us, in fact, requires us to draw the logical conclusion that when she's the swing vote, she's going to go with the minority. So she telegraphed how she would rule in this matter. She became the nominee. It was on the Republican Party platform that she should reverse the Obamacare cases. How are we not supposed to notice this when you say this in all caps? So please, let's not pretend that we are making up a connection between this appointment and the persistent Republican attack on our present health care system. So the first thing that you have to understand in looking at the Republican judicial selection process is that we're now looking at three. We're now looking at three nominees that have come through this process. It began when I was in Munich on a trip with Senator McCain and Judiciary Chairman Graham. He wasn't the chairman then, I don't believe, but we'd gone to the Munich Security Conference together, and word came, in fact, I believe Senator Barrasso was there as well, who is now presiding. Word came that Justice Scalia had died on a hunting vacation and that there was a vacancy, and it became quickly evident that Merrick Garland, the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a very widely respected judge, someone about whom Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee had said very good things in the past, presumably a consensus nominee, was likely to be the nominee of President Obama, a man who very often tried for consensus and very often was spurned. In this case, it did not take long for someone to decide that that was not going to happen, and indeed that no Obama nominee was going to be brought forward. It happened quickly, but not so quickly that a few members of the Senate said that they would, of course, meet with the nominee. That would be standard practice. Of course they would. But in the event, my recollection is that no one did. No Republican senator did. And that was a very sudden pivot by an entire body of people to go from normal process to something very new and abnormal. And in my experience, when a whole lot of people all pivot together to go from what is normal to something that is new and abnormal, you look for a reason. If you see all the branches blowing in one direction on a tree, you may be indoors. You may not actually be able to feel the wind blowing. But when you see all the branches lean, you can draw the reasonable conclusion, in fact, you can draw perhaps the only reasonable conclusion, that there is a wind blowing those branches. Which begs the question, what was the wind blowing all those branches to so immediately step out of the norms of the Senate? Not just one or two or 10, but as an entire caucus, and pivot to this new abnormal response to a presidential nominee. To me, that's a sign. That's a sign that political force is being applied, that a strong wind is blowing, and that all the branches have to lean in the same direction. And on we went through that process with very, very strong statements being made by judges about this newly found principle that during an election year, you don't confirm Supreme Court justices. They invented that new principle, highly convenient to that moment, but they described it as a principle. Here is Senator Daines in 2016. I don't think it's right to bring a nominee forward in an election year. He put it in about the strongest moral terms that one could use. He used terms of principle. He used the distinction between right and wrong. I don't think it's right to bring a nominee forward in an election year. Why? So that the people's voice, the people who've already begun voting, have their voice reflected. So that was probably, I don't know, maybe 8 months before the election. Here we are closer to 8 days before the election, and we're going through this process, and there's been this extraordinarily abrupt reversal of that supposed principle from 2016. I don't think it's right. If it's not right, why are we doing it right now? Suddenly, it's right in 2020. And Senator Daines wasn't alone. Mitch McConnell is the Senate floor orchestrator of all of this. Of course, he said, of course, the American people should have a say in the court's direction. That's why we can't take up Judge Garland now. because the American people should have their say months before the election. Here we are days before the election. Flipso, changeo. What could that mean? Senator Grassley, the American people shouldn't be denied a voice. That was then. This is now. Lindsey Graham, hold the tape. Hold my words against me, the chairman said. If an opening, here was his rule, if an opening comes in the last year of President Trump's term, we'll wait till the next election. Could you get clearer than that? If an opening comes in the last year of President Trump's term, we'll wait till the next election. Hold the tape. Ted Cruz, you don't do this in an election year. So what does it signal when people take a stand, assertedly on principle, that it wouldn't be right, Steve Daines, that you don't do this, Ted Cruz, that of course, the American people should have their say, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Grassley. What does it say when people take a stand on principle on one occasion, and then on the very next occasion, in the very next election, at the first opportunity, they completely reverse themselves on their supposed principle? Well, one possibility is that there has been a mini pandemic in the Senate of hypocrisy. That somehow there's a little germ here, and somebody brought hypocrisy into the Republican caucus, and everybody caught it. And they feel an unhealthy desire to go out and violate principles that they espoused on the previous occasion. That doesn't seem very credible to me. What seems more credible is that something is blowing the branches. That there is a force, a political force at work that causes Republican senators to take a firm stand on principle, albeit a novel one, a peculiar one, an unprecedented one, but in their words, a firm stand on principle in the 2016 election, and exactly in the very next case, in the 2020 election, completely reverse that supposed principle. My experience in politics is that when you see people forced to engage in hypocrisy in broad daylight, look for power in the shadows. So we began with the Garland-Gorsuch switcheroo based on this "you don't do this in an election year" principle. Then we went on to Judge Kavanaugh. And the narrative has developed on the Republican side that Judge Kavanaugh was treated very unfairly, as if no witness came forward to testify in the Senate Judiciary Committee that she had been assaulted by a young Brett Kavanaugh. I don't know what we were supposed to do with that information. Were we supposed to tell the good professor, go away, we don't want to hear from you? Sorry, it's a little late. The chance that a person headed for the Supreme Court might have committed sexual assault is something we don't take at all seriously. We don't want to get to the bottom of it. We don't want to know. This was a woman who was willing to come and testify in front of all of America, subject herself to the hostile questioning of a professional prosecutor hired by the Republicans just for that occasion. And she stuck to her guns and, in my view, was credible. To this day, I still believe her. The nature of her testimony was very consistent with the testimony of sexual assault victims who have been through that kind of an ordeal. Do I know what happened? No. But she was a credible witness, and she was willing to come into the Senate Judiciary Committee and claim that Brett Kavanaugh assaulted her. Of course, we had to hear from her. Republicans want to blame Democrats for that, but seriously? Would you not have let her testify? Really? That does not seem very credible. So she came, she testified, she was credible, despite the right wing having launched their flying monkeys at her in such vehemence that she had to leave her house, hire private security, go into hiding. She nevertheless came, she nevertheless was credible. And all we asked for was an investigation to find out what had happened. Do our best to get to the bottom of it. It was going to be difficult because it happened years ago. But it would seem to me that we owed this institution and the Supreme Court our best effort. Did we get a best effort? No. We got a slipshod, truncated decision that to this day the FBI refuses to answer questions about. Why? Why not give Dr. Blasey Ford, why not give the American people, why not give the Supreme Court a best effort from the FBI to get to the bottom of whatever happened? There is every indication that the tip line that the FBI set up was never reviewed and followed up on. I've been a prosecutor. I've run the Attorney General's office in Rhode Island, which is the lead prosecutive office for the state. I've been the U.S. Attorney for Rhode Island, running federal prosecutions. The whole purpose of a tip line is to bring in evidence from the public, sort through it, because every tip line has bonkers evidence in it, but you sort through the chaff to see if there's any wheat there, if there's anything that needs to be looked into. It does not appear that the FBI looked into anything that came in through the tip line. It looks like the tip line, if you could imagine the comments box It looks like they attached the comments box directly to the dumpster so that the tips went straight into the waste bin. I know of no tip that got followed up on. So once again, why? Why would the FBI allow itself to be associated with a truncated, incomplete investigation? Well, they said why. They said it was because they were not operating like an FBI when they do this. They're operating as the agent of the White House. They are operating at the White House's bidding when they are doing these confirmation investigations. They don't behave like the FBI then and follow their procedures. They do as they are told. That's a pretty strong clue, and once again a signal of powerful political forces at work to try to cram nominees, even very troubled ones, onto the Supreme Court. And then we come to Judge Barrett, who had to be the subject of this massive flipso-changeo of what was right for judicial nominees in an election year, and innumerable minor broken rules along the way. As I said, in all three of these recent nominations, there is a trail of procedural wreckage through the Senate. I don't think my colleagues hate Senate procedure. I don't think they get a form of malicious glee out of smashing Senate procedure. When you see a lot of procedural wreckage in the Senate, look for a motive. Look for a force. Look for a force. So 3 for 3. We've seen powerful signals of a motive force at work. And sure enough, when you look at the process itself, you see some real peculiarities. First of all, when these judges got selected, they had something in common. They all went through a process hosted at the Federalist Society and run by a person named Leonard Leo. The Wall Street Journal editorial page editor described this relationship as a subcontractor. The judicial selection got subcontracted out to this private organization and its operative. Subcontracted out. The White House counsel said this organization was insourced to the White House. Leonard Leo was put on temporary leave from the Federalist Society, like that's a big deal, to supervise the process. Can we just stop for a minute and accept that it is weird that any private organization would be made the subcontractor for the selection of Supreme Court justices? I don't care if it's the Girl Scouts of America. It's weird and it's wrong that a private organization should be the subcontractor for selecting judges. And it gets weirder and wronger when you see the big anonymous money pouring into that organization. The Washington Post took a pretty good, thorough look into this scheme, and they said that the whole scheme was $250 million worth of dark money. $250 million. They described it as a conservative activist behind-the-scenes campaign to remake the nation's courts. On whose behalf, one wonders, but you don't know, because the $250 million, the most of it is anonymous money, what we call around here dark money. So you have the last three nominees selected by a private organization, secretively, which was also taking huge donations from anonymous donors. The whole scheme run up to $250 million, according to the Washington Post. That's a pretty big deal. And if you can't see that that is a recipe for corruption, you are wearing blinders. Because the idea that a private organization becomes designated to pick who's on the Supreme Court and then takes big anonymous donations is a prescription for disaster. But it does produce nominees, and at the end you get your selection. 1, 2, 3. Then those nominees get TV campaigns run for them. There's a big PR effort, a political effort. And that's run by something called the Judicial Crisis Network, which had as its operative Carrie Severino. Judicial Crisis Network gets boatloads of anonymous money also. So the same problem of a private organization, a secretive organization that takes boatloads of anonymous money, having a central role in campaigning for these nominees, that is also abnormal. This is new, this is peculiar, and this is wrong, in my view. By the way, when that Washington Post article came out, Leonard Leo got blown like an agent in a covert operation. And to protect the Federalist Society, he had to jump out, go do something else. So he went out to go do dark money-funded voter suppression. And guess who jumped into his role for Judge Barrett? Well, none other than Ms. Severino. And by the way, the Judicial Crisis Network's offices are next to the Federalist Society's offices. Same building, same floor. And how big is the money? Well, here's a little filing from the Judicial Crisis Network. From its IRS Form 990. Look at this. Got a contribution for $17.9 million. $17.9 million. Do we know who gave them $17.9 million to put on TV ads for a judicial nominee that had been selected by the dark money group behind the Federalist Society? We do not. We do not. But somebody wrote a $17 million check to support a PR campaign for a Supreme Court nominee. How do we know they didn't have business before the Supreme Court? How do we know that when they're anonymous? And by the way, they did it again. Somebody gave $17 million to push off Garland and help Gorsuch. And then another $17+ million gift came in for the troubled Kavanaugh nomination. Do we know that it's not the same donor? No, we don't. It could be the same donor, in which case somebody gave $35 million anonymously to influence the makeup of our United States Supreme Court. And they may have business before the court. There's a case called the Caperton case, in which the Supreme Court said you had a due process right not to have judges who'd had big money spent on their behalf to get the office rule in your case. This looks like a Caperton problem. $35 million spent by conceivably one donor who may very well have business before the court. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? Why would you ever allow judicial nominees to be selected this way, funded by dark money, anonymously, controlled by private, secretive organizations? Why would you do that? Why is that acceptable at all? I submit that were the shoe on the other foot, the other side would have its hair on fire about such a performance. The fact that this seems okay is yet another indication of the branches blowing in the wind here, because it is not okay by any objective or reasonable standard. The only thing that makes this okay is if that political force makes this okay in the same way they made it okay to reverse the 2016 principle on the very next occasion in 2020. When you see hypocrisy in the daylight, look for power in the shadows. And it doesn't end once their judges are selected and once the judges have their campaigns paid for by $17 million check writers. When they're on the court, guess who shows up in orchestrated choruses? Groups funded by dark money. In some cases, they are the litigating lawyer group. In some cases, they come on afterwards. That's what are called friends of the court, amici curiae, friends of the court. We had one case that I looked at about the Consumer Financial Protection Board where it turned out that a whole bunch of amici showed up, amici curiae, friends of the court, a whole bunch of them. So I did this graphic in my brief that I filed, and it showed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 briefs filed in that case by nominally separate groups, all funded by the same organization, Donors Trust. 8 out of 11 funded by the Bradley Foundation, and more overlapping donors throughout. This was just my work. Center for Media and Democracy went back and did an even more thorough drill down and came to even more astonishing conclusions about the overlap between the funding of these groups showing up in these orchestrated choruses. By the way, they don't tell the court that they're all funded by the same groups. They don't tell the other parties that they're all funded by the same groups. There's actually a disclosure in the briefing rule that says you're supposed to disclose who paid for your briefing. They use that to mean who paid for the printing of the brief. So you can take $1 million contribution from somebody, or who knows, $17 million contribution from somebody, and then pay a couple of $1,000 yourself to have the brief published and disclose nothing to the court, nothing to the parties about who's really behind these phony baloney, trumped up front group friends of the court. But they do provide an educating chorus for the judges and tell them how to rule. And by the way, the Center for Media Democracy showed that not only is the funding going to these legal groups, but the same funding is going over there to the Federalist Society to support this judicial selection operation. And from Judicial Crisis Network, you have the interchangeable Leonard Leo and Carrie Severino. This looks like a single scheme through which a small group of very secretive, big money donors capable of writing a $17 million check to help influence who's on the Supreme Court, get together and control the selection of Supreme Court justices, fund the PR campaigns and the TV advertisements for those Supreme Court justices, and then show up through front groups to pitch the justices on what they want from them. That is about as unhealthy a situation for a court as one could have. Again, we're like the frog, the alleged frog in the pot. It's gotten worse and worse. It has stunk more and more. But it happened kind of gradually, and we've, for some reason, have acted as if this is somehow normal. There is nothing normal about this. As a lawyer, I spent a good deal of my life in appellate courts. I've argued in the United States Supreme Court. I've argued in several circuit courts of appeal. I've argued over and over again before our state Supreme Court. To the extent that I had a specialty, it was appellate law. As the governor's legal counsel in Rhode Island, I was involved in picking judges for the state courts. On the Judiciary Committee, I've been involved in picking judges for the federal courts. Folks, this is weird. This is not right. Nobody behaves this way. Nobody farms out the selection of judges to private interest groups that don't disclose their donors and take up to $250 million into the scheme, according to the Washington Post. Weird enough that people feel the need to run TV ads for judicial nominees. But when they're taking a check for $17 million, 2 checks for $17 million from an anonymous donor, or maybe 2 anonymous donors, yeah, if you think that's weird, it's because it is. That shouldn't happen anywhere around a court. And if there's one thing that we are entitled to, there have been a lot of high-minded speeches about the importance of the judiciary and its independence and all of that. The most important standard that a court must meet is that it is not a pantomime court. A pantomime court in which the rituals of adjudication get acted out. People come to the bench wearing their robes, hear the arguments, render decisions, read the briefs. But at the end of the day, the decision is cooked by big, special interest influence that insinuated its way into the court by controlling the selection of judges, by funding the PR campaigns for those judges, and by being the orchestrating force behind the amici curiae. And you might think that I'm being a little aggressive, suggesting that they're orchestrated. Well, remember this group, the Bradley Foundation, that I showed you from my Supreme Court checklist that funded 8 out of the 11 groups in that case? Here's a memo of a grant they're giving to something called the Judicial Education Project, which is a sister organization to that same Judicial Crisis Network. This is a little bit of a pea in a shell game, so forgive me, but they're directly related groups. And the staff recommendation says that at this highest of legal levels, it's a request for funding for amici curiae at the Supreme Court in several cases, it is very important to orchestrate high-caliber amicus efforts. Orchestrate. For Pete's sake, the secret funders use the word orchestrate themselves. So something is up. Something is not right. Something is rotten in Denmark. And if the American people are good enough to entrust us with the ability to answer their questions about this mess, we will answer their questions about this mess. I will tell you, I cannot get my questions answered. Not without gavels. Not in this Senate, not in these committees. But I think it matters if an individual wrote $35 million worth of checks to influence the makeup of our United States Supreme Court, to know whether they had business before the court, to know who they were, to be able to even do the Caperton analysis of whether some party's due process rights have been infringed by influence. So, in some respects, this is the end of things. This is the third of 3 nominees that have all had the same characteristics. They've been selected through this scheme. They've been campaigned for through this scheme. They've generated bizarre procedural behavior in this Senate. All 3 for 3. It's like the triple trifecta. 3 judges, 3 characteristics. Selected, campaigned for, bizarre procedural anomalies. And when you see that kind of behavior, that's a lot of branches leaning the same way. And if that doesn't mean the wind is blowing, then give me a better explanation. But I think there's a foul wind blowing. And we need to find out who's behind it. And we need to find out what it means for our treasured Supreme Court. I'll close by saying that the results are already coming in. Even before Judge Barrett gets to the court, the results are already coming in from this effort. I did an article some time ago that we had pretty thoroughly fact-checked, red-teamed, and reviewed, that at the time said that there were 72 decisions by the United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roberts that had the following characteristics. 1, they were 5-4 decisions, the narrowest, barest majority. Ordinarily, a Supreme Court likes to see bigger majorities than that because it's conducive to the integrity and strength and credibility of the court. 72 5-4 decisions. They had an additional characteristic, not just 5-4, a partisan 5-4. No Democratic appointee joined the 5. So again, if you're an institutionalist, you look at that and you think, maybe that's not the court putting its best foot forward. That's an awful lot of partisan 5-4 decisions. And then the third characteristic is that you can identify quite readily in those cases a big Republican donor's interest, something that they would want by way of an outcome. And what we calculated at the time in that article is that the score in those 72 5-4 partisan decisions with a big Republican donor interest implicated is that the score was 72-0. Some pitching balls and calling balls and strikes. 72-0, that's a rout. And we've been tracking it since then. I put the number now at 80-0 because the article was written some time ago. So now we're at 80 partisan 5-4 cases in which a big Republican donor interest was implicated and in which 80-0, the big interests won. Now, some of these are pretty flagrant. I think Citizens United is going to go down in history as a disgraceful decision of the United States Supreme Court, sort of the political equivalent of Lochner. Shelby County, in which the court made up facts in order to strip a section out of the Voting Rights Act that in turn unleashed voter suppression laws across the states that had been held back by the pre-clearance provisions that the court summarily decided 5-4 that it didn't like any longer. Janus, the case that took down a 40-year-old precedent involving labor law in which legal groups had an astonishing role. That case actually went through 4 cases along the way. It's a long saga. I won't burden this speech with that now. But the end of the day is that the lawyers for the labor movement walking up to the Supreme Court for argument that day knew perfectly well how the court was going to rule. That's not how courts should operate. Heller, the gun case, 5-4. A former Supreme Court justice had described the theory that Heller adopted as a fraud on the public. But Heller turned a fraud on the public into the law of the land. And guess what? The NRA is very active as a donor in these fights. The NRA was all over the Kavanaugh nomination in particular. So you had these flagrant decisions. I just mentioned those 4, but they're 80, so that leaves 76 others. And they're usually, often I should say, about power. They're often about moving power into corporations, expanding corporate power, allowing unlimited money into elections, allowing dark, anonymous, unlimited money to operate in elections. Who benefits from that? Entities with unlimited money and a motive to spend it, like, say, the fossil fuel industry. Intervening in elections, allowing bulk gerrymandering to proceed. Multiple courts had figured out how to stop that nefarious practice. It's actually not complicated when you're dealing with bulk gerrymandering, how to stop it. And over again, these bulk gerrymandering efforts to take an entire delegation and try to cook it so that it doesn't represent the popular vote in that state. Over and over again, courts had seen through that, figured out how to respond to it, until it got to the Supreme Court, and then 5-4, sorry, folks. We're not going to take an interest in that. Keep at it. Voter suppression. We'll tear down the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. All this election mischief that leans heavily to supporting the Republican side has been supported. Deregulation. If you're a big polluter, if you're a big donor, you probably don't like regulatory agencies. You probably would like to have some more freedom from regulatory agencies. And over again, these decisions try to hurt the independence and strength of regulatory agencies. Over and over. And then the last is the civil jury. My God, the civil jury is in the Constitution, for Pete's sake. We fought so hard over the civil jury that people didn't want to adopt the Constitution until there was a Seventh Amendment that protected it in the Bill of Rights. Protecting the civil jury was in the Declaration of Independence. Interference with the civil jury by the Crown was a cause of war in the Revolutionary era. The civil jury is an institution of governance in this country. It is a big deal. And yet these supposed originalists on the court keep tearing down, whittling away at, diminishing and degrading the civil jury. Because guess what? If you are a big, powerful, well-funded, lobbyist-greased corporation or interest group, you can march around this place like a king, throwing your money around, getting everybody to bow and scrape for you, lobbyists smoothing the path for you. You can wander into the executive branch if you've got the right control and get your stooges appointed to the regulatory agencies. You can be powerful. You can get your way. And then you have to suffer the indignity of showing up in a courtroom where you have to be treated equally before the law, where what you say has to be put to the test of perjury, where you got to turn over your real documents and not phonied up position papers, where if you tamper with the jury, it's a crime. No wonder big special interests don't like civil juries. And no wonder this court, 5-4, over and over again, chops away at the institution of the civil jury. But don't tell me that you're being an institutionalist or an originalist when you're attacking an institution in the Constitution, in the Seventh Amendment, the Bill of Rights. That's the work that these 85-4 partisan decisions have been doing. It has been to turn this court more and more into the servant of big corporations. And guess what? Americans are paying attention. There was a poll a little while ago that asked whether the Supreme Court favors corporations more than people or people more than corporations. And the poll showed 49-7. 7 times as many Americans think that the Supreme Court views corporations more favorably than people than, say, the court views people more favorably than corporations. So something's out, something's up, a foul wind is blowing. There is way too much anonymous money in and around this court process. It is, by the way, at the same time, the only court that does not have a code of ethics in the federal system. When Judge Barrett is elevated from her circuit court to the Supreme Court, she will go from a court that has a judicial code of conduct to a court that does not. She will go from a court that requires transparent disclosure of gifts, travel, and hospitality to a court that requires less disclosure not only than circuit courts, requires less disclosure than cabinet officials, requires less disclosure than members of Congress. The highest court has the lowest standards for ethics and transparency. So to all of my colleagues who have given speeches about the integrity and value of the Supreme Court and our judicial branch, I hope you'll help us as we try to look at what on earth is exactly going on over there. Why amici curiae show up in court without disclosing who they're really there for. Why $17+ million checks are being written by anonymous individuals. What the relationship is between the $250 million that poured into Leonard Leo's effort is and who got chosen. What the expectations were of the people who spent $250 million to influence the makeup of the Supreme Court. And why the highest court has the lowest standards for ethics and for transparency. We are not in a good place right now with this court. The things that are happening are truly bizarre, unprecedented, bad enough that there should be dark money in elections. Dark money in judicial selection? Please defend that if you think that's right. Please defend that if you think that's right. If you think that big special interests should be able to write big anonymous checks and thereby gain a voice in the composition of the United States Supreme Court, please come and defend that proposition, because I don't think you can. It has never been the case in the Supreme Court before. It has never been the case in the circuit courts of appeal before. It has never been the case in state Supreme Courts, in my experience. The dark money influence in and around the court is unprecedented, and it is wrong, and the American people are entitled to the truth about it. I see I've gone into my next speaker's time a bit, so I will yield the floor. If I may check a minute and see if the floor needs to be put into a quorum call. You're okay with that? Great. Then I will note the absence of a quorum.
Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Alexander.